Okay everyone, so welcome to episode 2 of the Q&A series. Just want to give a big shout out and a thank you if you sent across any messages for the previous video or indeed for this one. It's a huge help, and like I said, I do want this to become something that's fairly regular, so just going to go straight into the questions that I got this time around. Did get quite a few more, so a couple of them will be answered fairly quickly. Throughout the entire video, if anyone is interested in like a bit more of a comprehensive breakdown on the topic itself, you want like an entirely separate video, then obviously just leave a comment below and I will get back to that. So the first question is squatting or deadlifting first within a training session, okay? Now I'll leave a link somewhere in like the description. I did actually write an entire article on this, on exercise order and how it influences different training cycles, different goals and whatnot. But to keep it kind of simple, the first question that you need to ask is the specificity question, okay? So which is it that you want to get stronger? Which is it that's kind of your key focus? In that scenario, it's the one that you want to dedicate the most energy to. So usually we tend to go off neurological stimulus or neurological load, and in most scenarios, speed would be the first thing that you would address. But in this scenario, neither movement really occurs at a velocity that's going to be acutely affected. So you don't really have to worry about that one too much necessarily. If you aren't wanting to focus specifically on one movement and you just want to get stronger overall, you want both movements to be stronger, then that's also fine, obviously. But it doesn't have to be a question from the specificity element. What it needs to be then is more from the overall load, okay? Now, the key thing here isn't absolute load necessarily. If you're one of the people that's, deadlifting 400 plus kilograms or something like that, then it's slightly different rules. But primarily what you need to be focusing on is what we classify as relative load, particularly on a joint by joint level, okay? What I mean by this is, if you imagine a 300 kilogram squat to full depth versus a 350 kilogram deadlift, the 300 kilogram squat, although it's a slightly lighter load, on like a joint by joint level, the actual biomechanical force that goes through that joint is technically higher, particularly when it comes to the deepest range of motion, because obviously the stability demand is at its highest as well. That's something that a lot of people don't necessarily take into account. So in terms of the inherent injury risk and also the overload to the connective tissue in that area, it's technically higher. Again, this does depend on individual build and whatnot. Some people, when they squat, they have a technique that basically takes them to a mid-range position around the hip, whereas with the deadlift it might be full range. Again, does depend on individual build and individual technique, but that's a key thing to bear in mind, is the relative load along with the absolute. So in most scenarios, because you tend to go through a larger range of motion in the squat, we would put the squat at the start. Yeah, it's the movement that demands the highest stability and the highest relative load. So if you're just trying to address both, I would usually say that the squat is the one that I would go with first. Next question. Best tips for building muscle. Really struggle to gain size, okay? The first thing, there's a couple of things that I want to go through here, but the first thing that I would make sure that you have kind of ticked off is the nutritional element, okay? Now, the key reason being is you need an abundance of nutrients. Now, that isn't an abundance of calories, but you can't build muscle out of nothing unless you're an absolute beginner. The body is inherently conservative, which is something we'll talk about with another question later on. And it doesn't necessarily like to waste energy on things that it doesn't deem to be a useful asset, yeah? And super maximal amounts or super physiological, amounts of muscle, they're not really worth it in the mind of the body. And because muscle is metabolically costly, it demands energy to have. So you have to give it a surplus of nutrients. Now, the kind of discrepancy here comes to the surplus and the deficit discussion. I can do a separate video on this, and usually people would say that a surplus is absolutely essential, and in many instances it is, okay? It's not always the case. You don't have to be in a significant surplus. You don't have to go through the bulking and the cutting side of things. To keep it completely simple, if you're watching this and thinking, well, no, I've heard it everywhere else, just ask yourself the question: if you're eating 10,000 calories a day of absolute shite, okay, even if you've got like quote unquote optimum protein intake and everything like that, but it comes from really processed meats, the leucine concentration is really, really low, your digestive capacity is really low as well, versus eating 8,000 calories, again, these are stupid numbers, but just taking into account, versus eating 8,000 calories of really good quality food with a high food composition. Are you honestly telling me that the first scenario is going to be better for building muscle? A lot of people think it is, but you've got to take that into account, what's called nutrient partitioning. It's how your body utilizes the food that it takes in. You've got to remember that. It's something that people often don't factor in, yeah? The calories that are on the tin or on the packaging aren't the calories that your body utilizes. It's the same with the nutrient intake, the protein, all that type of stuff. So I would make sure that you, without going into a full breakdown of the diet side of things, make sure that you have an abundance of nutrients. That's kind of the key. And then the number one tip I would give, it's as usual, as is always the case with me, it's a little bit more long-winded, but I'm trying to educate everyone to take a little bit more intuition on how they train rather than just giving a definitive answer. If you want a definitive answer, really, really simple, lift heavy and lift a lot. You know, for lots of reps over a long period of time, there you go, that's how you build muscle. But for something that's a little bit, you know, you can take away, I would get you to understand what's called a resistance profile. Now, movements, all a resistance profile is during a movement how the load acts on the body and at which point there is the point of peak tension, okay? So a classic example would be a squat versus something like a lateral raise, okay? In a squat, the point of peak tension is where the joints or the muscles are at their most stretched position, yeah? It's the base of the squat. No one fails a squat within the final quarter range of motion unless they've lost the balance or something like that, but that's not the real issue. That's not the point of peak tension. Whereas with a lateral raise, no one struggles to move the dumbbell from here to the first, third of the movement. It's always the upper portion. Now, with that, you can kind of start, it opens the world up to exercise selection and also exercise execution, particularly for building muscle. When we talk about lifting heavy, it's the highest amount of mechanical tension that we can create. So the current prevailing kind of theory with how we build muscle, like on a physiological level, is mechanical tension, which is the conversion of tension through a muscle into a hypertrophic response. Muscular damage, which is kind of being debunked a little bit, but that's the whole, tearing of a muscle and rebuilding of it. And then metabolic stress, which is the accumulation of metabolic byproducts, so the pump that everyone talks about. So with each of those, we know that mechanical tension is kind of the key, but what you're going to remember is it's the mechanical tension through the muscle, not through the joint or through the biomechanical structure. And all that means is, again, if we look back to the resistance profiles, I'm hoping that this isn't too quick, if you look back to the resistance profiles, you want to spend more time in the point of peak tension, not less time there. And again, going back to what we talked about a moment ago with the body being fairly conservative, people tend to avoid that inherently because it's more difficult. Yeah, why would you, why would your body want to spend more time where it's having to use more energy? So, for example, the stretched position of an incline bicep curl, that is the point of peak tension. So, in that scenario, you want to be spending more time there. In a lateral raise, don't lift the weight and then bounce in that upper portion. Spend more time and try and squeeze the muscle into position. That will net you a larger result. And like I said, if you can kind of grasp that concept of resistance profiles, it opens up every exercise and it will directly tell you how to execute the movement. So that would be my number one tip. Again, if you want like individual breakdowns or examples, just fire a message over and I can have a look through your program and tell you, what tempos to use, that type of thing. Okay, so the next one, I'm bored on rest days and you want to train, what can you do to continue to improve? Okay, so the main thing that I would get you to focus on with this is to, first of all, distinguish or define the difference between training, development, or just exercise and activity in general, okay? Training is subject to what's called an SRA curve, or the understanding of SRA curves. SRA curves are just a stimulus recovery adaptation. It's basically a long-winded way of saying that different components that you train take longer or shorter time scales to recover so that you can overload them again. A classic example of this would be to compare a golfer to a powerlifter, okay? Powerlifting, even at the absolute highest level, it is not a sport that requires a massive amount of skill. The technique is important and it's something that can continue to be refined, but compare that to something like a golf swing, which is almost exclusively skill. There's almost no physical capacity that's required to do it. In that scenario, look at how the most successful people train, okay? A golfer won't perform their drive or practice their drive once a week or once a month because it's too overloading. They'll perform it every single day or whenever they're going through that individual practice, but it's a lot more frequent because it's a higher skill demand. And skill is kind of the key one, key fitness components focus on here is it recovers very, very quickly. In the concept of training, a lot of like the top strength coaches, particularly in like Olympic weightlifting and stuff, they tend to say that anything below 60% of your 1RM doesn't net a massive recovery demand on a relative level anyway. So that would be where you would perform the majority of your skill work, and it should allow your body to recover on a rest day within a 24-hour cycle. So it shouldn't affect the next kind of training session that you have. That does change a little bit when you're pushing numbers upwards of like 300 kilos and that type of stuff, but even then, you're not going to net a massive fatigue response from deadlifting 150 kilograms if you are deadlifting 300. Another thing to focus on, or rather two things to focus on that tend to net a fairly large amount of like fatigue, is psychological arousal, okay, or neurological hype, where you tend to get like really fired up for a movement. You want to try and keep that to an absolute minimum on these rest days. So a really good tip that I tend to use is don't put on, like I'm a big fan of music when I train. It's something that really stimulates that side of the lifting. I would make sure that I wouldn't listen to anything that causes that kind of trigger. And another thing would be eccentric damage, or even extreme joint ranges of motion. Again, both of those scenarios, they tend to overload connective tissue a little bit more, which has a longer time span for recovery. So basically, on those rest days, set a goal, treat it like a slightly separate program, and focus on the fitness components that tend to recover quickest. Main ones being skill, strength, endurance, provided the eccentric capacity is low, and then mobility. Mobility is a key one as well. So pick a yoga pose, try and build up to being able to do it. Really simple. Okay. Next one, how to balance running and strength training. Okay, so I did actually talk about this one briefly in the last video. That was specific to a marathon, so you can kind of go and check that if you want. But the key thing that I would say, understand that running is a coordinated movement the same way we deadlift and we squat, and treat it like that, okay? I'm not a runner, clearly, but the fundamental mistake that I see people do is it happens the world over. They think, and this is one of the things that appeals to a lot of people, is the barrier of entry is fairly low. But they think that slapping on a pair of shoes, doing like that little lunge stretch, and the stretches you used to do it, you know, in sports at high school, that's enough. And then you just run until your lungs feel like they're going to explode, you collapse a little bit, and then you come back and have a little cry and realise that's why cardio is so bad. Or at least that's what happens when I run. But the key thing is that running is very, very coordinated, and there is a huge technical element to it. Most people, when they run, they will heel strike with the foot out in front of them, and they'll have a forward head posture. Straight away, you're wasting energy by creating a braking force on every single step that you run on. Now, I'm not saying go into barefoot running and go ultra extreme and, you know, treat yourself like a robot and expect to become the next Kipchoge, but approach it with a similar focus. Yeah, don't have this really structured approach to strength training and then just slap on trainers and run. The next thing would be on the running side to vary your tempo. This kind of falls in line with the technique. Vary your tempo, vary your surface, and vary the goal. A lot of people, again, they just jump on the treadmill, they pick a distance and they go. Rather than doing uphill running, rather than doing sprints to work on like stride length. The idea is approach your running with a little bit more variety than just simply putting on trainers and going. Now, in terms of balancing the two, this is something, again, I touched on briefly in the last video, so I won't go into too much detail, but don't be afraid of the interference effect. It's not as big as people think, particularly on like a muscle protein synthesis level. It's more about your actual resources and what you choose to dedicate your time to. I would be clear in terms of balancing the two. I would be clear in terms of what your goals are. Don't expect to become an elite level powerlifter and want to only train twice on the strength side and then run twice a week as well. You can still include running because it does help, and they actually complement one another provided that the balance is there. But yeah, I would make sure that you know what your goal is and being clear between the two, because then you won't kind of blur the lines in terms of what is the priority. Within your strengths training side of things, I would make sure that first of all you place a heavy emphasis on activation. Again, going back to the running, a lot of people when they do perform running, they tend to get tightness in muscles that aren't used to being stimulated in those ranges. So they tend to go into training sessions with a little bit more tightness in their hip flexors than usual, around the calves. And if you're the type of person that's hypermobile, for example, you think that won't make a difference, you'll still be able to squat no problem, but it might actually decrease like glute activity and stability around the hip, and then you wonder why you start getting knee pain when you're squatting and running. It's not that either task is the thing that is causing it, it's just that you're not preparing for it. So that'd be another tip, would be to make sure that you activate properly and mobilize and warm up between each training session. And then the final thing that I would say, again, touched on this last time, but the interference effect, the only time I've seen it, at least in practice anyway, is more to do with the elasticity versus stiffness component. A lot of people, when they are lifting, they're focusing more on producing force and lifting things, and they're not necessarily focusing on absorbing or being able to control things. And that's where you're going wrong pretty much straight away, is when you run, it's primarily an eccentric based activity. It's the reason why a lot of marathon runners aren't necessarily jacked and huge, because the tendons tend to do the majority of the work and the muscles just kind of contract eccentrically, load the tendon and spring back again, provided you've got good technique. So when you are performing the lifting, if all you're doing is focusing on producing force and not necessarily on how to control it, they're not complementing one another, they're just running in completely different directions. Even if it's just like drop landing mechanic work and focusing on being able to absorb force just as much as produce it. Okay, and then the next question is tips on staying motivated and injury free. Okay, with this one, I just want to preface to say that it's going to be a little bit of a discussion about pain. Now, if people are interested and want me to break down kind of the current approach to handling pain, particularly in training or out of training, then please do just leave a comment down below or send me a message directly. The first thing I would do is get you to set a goal that is linked to the injury but doesn't hinge on it. That's the key mistake I see people make, is they expect getting rid of the injury to be their primary focus, and I completely understand why, but they link the pain to the injury, and pain is completely varied dependent upon emotional state, sleep quality. There is so many variables that come into play. If you want a really simple example of how to explain this, if I'm stood in front of you and I punch you really, really hard, and you're having the best day of your life and you feel really energetic and we're having a bit of a laugh when I punch you, it's not going to hurt as much as if I punch you when you're hungover, you've been ill for 2 weeks and you've not eaten or slept for 2 days, let's say. It's going to hurt a hell of a lot more, and the stimulus is exactly the same, it's just how you experience it is slightly different. So with regards to the goal setting, if all you're doing is focusing on the pain, you're not going to build momentum. And we know this from a simple understanding of goal setting. The idea is you want to build momentum and try and continual forward kind of trajectory. You don't want to be in a scenario where it's one step forward, one step back, one step sideways or anything like that. Once you've done that, okay, and once you set that goal, I would make sure, and this again hinges on pretty much all aspects of behavioural change really, I would focus on changing your environment first as best you can, okay? If you can't squat, for example, because you've got chronic knee pain, don't walk straight to the squat rack when you get in the gym. Go to somewhere else. Go to the machine side first. Do a little bit of a pump on your upper body before you go into the bench. And I know it sounds daft, but the idea is you're making it harder than it needs to be if you're continuing to scroll through Instagram, looking at videos of people squatting and thinking, oh, I can't wait to get back to that. Sometimes it helps and sometimes it does spur you on, but it's usually only when you've got that forward momentum first. If you don't have that, all it does is it kind of reminds you of what you can't do rather than focusing on what you can. And then the next thing would be to run a program separately, okay, on addressing the issue, but be careful of where you actually place it. Again, a lot of people, once they're injured, they associate the concept of training with the injury, and every single time they go to the gym, it's like, right, I'm going to work on the injury, which is, again, absolutely fine, and it's something I would actively get you to focus on. But then your association becomes gym equals injury. And again, when we talk about what's called the biopsychosocial model of pain, which I'll go through if the interest is there, this association can actually cement this like neurological link to what pain actually is. And you want to be in a scenario where it's something separate that you're working on, not the sole focus. So a really simple tip there would be never end a session on the stability work, or never end a session on the thing that's fixing the pain. Always end it on something you enjoy. I won't talk about the reason why there, just trust me on that one. Or just do it entirely separately, do it at home, or do it something that's completely removed from the overload training that you're doing, because it'll just create that disparity and maintain that disparity so that you can continue to build momentum whilst the injury is there. Once it's gone, in terms of staying injury free, the key thing that I would get people to focus on isn't technique, okay? It's dose prescription or what we classify as stress management in general, okay? Technique does matter, of course it does, but I know a lot of people that have deadlifted with quote perfect technique or squatted with perfect technique that still come away with a lot of injuries. The simple thing is if the stress that you are creating, or the stress that you're going through training and also everything else in your life exceeds your recovery capacity, you're going to get injured at some point. It might be 3 years down the line, but it's going to accumulate and eventually it will come back to bite you. Try and pay diligent attention to stress management just as much as you do technique, because again, I said this in the last video, but we tend to focus on technique and overstate its importance with staying injury free and underestimate how important it is for getting you strong. And then we do the opposite with dose prescription. We focus on reps and sets and everything as the thing that get you strong, but don't pay attention to how the sets and the reps and the loads actually influence injury. So that would be my advice for that. Okay, and then the final question, if you've made it this far, okay, first of all, big brownie point and thank you, but the next one, very appropriately put, the fuck are you going on about with this impulse thing, okay? I'm going to preface this final bit by saying, it's very waffly, this bit, because I start talking about physics and all this type of stuff. But some people are interested, so I'm going to go into it. This was just purely to start to create a discussion behind the strategy through which we achieve these, quote, powerful movements, okay? Everyone talks about power, and we focus on power as force times velocity, which is great, but everyone focuses on speed and like rapid movements or lifting really, really heavy, and they forget that velocity is displacement over time. And in that scenario, the displacement is the range of motion. And what impulse does on like a really geeky level is it just analyzes the force that's being produced, okay, into a weight. So like when you're actually pressing through the weight, but also the time through which you apply that force, okay? And we see this with elite lifters, like right the way up to the top, and then we can look at the who I would classify as the kings of impulse. A lot of people say the power, but impulse is the key, which is Olympic weightlifters, okay? And basically, I want you to ask this question, okay? Or ask yourself this question, sorry. When you're lifting a weight, okay, when you're bench pressing, let's say, really simple exercise, most people do it, and you press the bar of your chest, are you putting in 100% to the whole range of motion, okay? Or, like we said earlier, with a point of peak tension, are you pressing as hard as you can off your chest and then actually relaxing a little bit towards the top? Like, really ask yourself a question, and I can guarantee that almost everyone will be able to, when they really, really think about it, go, yeah, no, I could probably put in a little bit more to the lockout or something like that, okay? Now, in that scenario, your impulse is actually a little bit lower than it could be. It's difficult to use a strength movement to explain it, but with power-based exercises, okay, or exercises that involve like continual acceleration, the key isn't always just producing more force, it's producing even the same amount of force over a longer period of time, okay? Because that will ultimately net a larger impulse, which is the thing that it's the strategy through which we get that power, okay? So a classic example would be an overhead movement. Let's take the push press because it's really simple. You don't really need as much technique as you do like a split jerk. You can focus on producing more force. You can focus on getting stronger, getting a stronger press, getting a stronger leg drive, everything like that. Or you can focus on getting higher on the extension, taking the dip position and driving and getting higher and higher and higher, and doing a lot of technique work on being able to apply force from that dip position right the way through to the absolute last moment, okay? Again, a really simple example of this, look towards the kings of impulse, or queens, 2021 and all that. Olympic weightlifting, okay, you'll hear the cues themselves that they use. It's finish the pull, like punch through, all these different cues of maximizing the full extension and of each movement or each phase. And then when they do pulls, for example, they will pull from varying heights, the mid-thigh, the hang, from blocks, even from deficits, because they want to make sure that during that clean, they are applying maximum force throughout the whole range, and there isn't a single point in which they're relaxing, okay? And that's the only reason I mentioned that impulse, was because I wanted people to just start to understand. It's probably overcomplicating it like I usually do, but that's the key thing there is don't just apply force over a longer period of time, okay? And I can guarantee, absolutely 100% guarantee, because it's just physics, that your numbers will go up. So everyone, thank you for tuning in to the second episode. Again, I hope you took something away from it. If you do have any other questions that I didn't necessarily cover or that don't apply to you, but you want a little bit more information, then fire a message over, leave them in the comments below, and I will definitely include them in the next episode. As always, stay strong, and I'll hopefully speak to some of you soon.